Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about experimental design. And what this really has to do with is how we can go about answering questions in science. So we got practice asking questions in lab yesterday, and today we're going to be talking about how we go about answering them. Um, so people talk about the scientific method as if it's sort of one thing, a very linear step-by-step process. But the scientific more generally is beyond what we're kind of showing in this. Oh, my laser pointer is freaking out. Beyond what we're showing in this slide, it's just any way that scientists can go about answering a question in a way that allows them to draw a valid conclusion or to figure out something they didn't know before. So there will be certain parts that should always show up when scientists are answering questions. So we'll always be making observations, we'll always be gathering data from an experiment, but the steps and the order of these steps isn't always the same. And sometimes you'll have to go back to a previous step, and it can be more of a circular process than a linear one. But for the sake of simplicity, for right now, we'll just talk about the sort of traditional standard step-by-step progression of the scientific method. So first, we're going to make observations. When we make those observations, maybe we'll see something that catches our interest, and from that, we'll ask questions. And then we'll try to figure out an explanation for or an answer to those questions. So this is the hypothesis, is an explanation or an answer that would explain what we saw and the questions that we were asking. From there, we're going to design an experiment to test that hypothesis. So we're going to figure out a way that we can figure out if our hypothesis is right or not. Once we've designed our experiment, then we can make a prediction. We'll think, if my hypothesis is correct, then what do I think I'll see when I actually carry out my experiment? And then finally, we will draw conclusions from that experiment and communicate results. Okay, so I think whether people think of the scientific method as something you only think about in science class, but I think that whether or not you've been thinking about the scientific method, a lot of us have used it without even thinking about it. So if you've ever noticed something like, "Oh, my phone isn't charging," that's an observation that you made. So that's the first step of the scientific method. And then we could also think of something more sciencey, like so a group of researchers noticed that after big hurricanes, like Hurricane Irma, there was the lizards on a certain island seemed to have bigger toes than what they thought the lizards had previously. So average lizard toe size seems bigger after hurricanes. That would be another observation. So if you remember a couple slides ago, you may recall the next step of the scientific method is to ask a question based on those observations. So we're going to be asking a question and forming a hypothesis. So we could wonder, why is my phone not charging? Or if we're looking at the lizard example, why do lizards have bigger toe pads after hurricanes? So it doesn't have to be a big jump from your observation to your question. It can follow in a pretty straightforward manner. Okay, so this is the big slide that I want to emphasize because this is where a lot of people get tripped up. So the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction. So if you're used to using an if-then format for a hypothesis, that's not what we're going to be doing in this class. We're going to be getting a little bit more nuanced between the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction. Okay, so here's what we're going to say each of them is. So a hypothesis is an explanation for what you're seeing or an answer to a question that you're asking. So it has to be testable is one big important thing here. So we have to be able to see whether a hypothesis is correct or incorrect. Um, and then a prediction is going to be a forecasting. So you're going to be you're going to be sort of predicting the future of what you think will happen after you carry out your experiment. And what you think is going to happen is going to be based on your hypothesis, based on your explanation. So this example of a hypothesis here is that omega-3 fatty acids, which, for example, you can find in fish, improve athletic performance by increasing the amount of oxygen in a tissue. And it's because it's due to reduced blood viscosity, so reducing blood thickness. So that's a lot of explanation, or it's a lot of like because sort of reasoning. And then here's a prediction. Subjects who exercise vigorously for 2 minutes will have a higher heart rate compared to when they started and compared to a resting control group. So that's saying if we test people's heartbeats after they do exercise, then the people who exercised will have higher heartbeats. So it's a prediction that um, if we make people exercise, this is what we'll see if, heart rate does increase due to exercise. So let's look at these two things, hypothesis and prediction, in our examples from previously. So yeah, a prediction follows from experimental design. We cannot make a prediction if we don't know what our experiment is. Okay. So going back to our two examples, we had the observation that my phone isn't charging, and we probably wonder, like, why is my phone not charging? There are a number of possible hypotheses we could make. One possible explanation for your phone not charging would be that the wall socket, or like the wall outlet, is broken. Another explanation would be that the port on your phone, like where the charging cable plugs in, maybe that's broken. Or maybe a hypothesis is that, oh, I see that this charging cable is kind of like falling apart and the wires are showing. Maybe the charging cable for my phone is broken. So if that's our explanation for our observation of my phone isn't charging, why is that happening? Then we could make a prediction that if we change the cable that we're using, then the phone will charge. So if I use my friend's charging cable, then I can get my phone to charge. But if I was to use my same charging cable and just use a different outlet, then my phone wouldn't charge. So a prediction is going to follow from the explanation that you came up with. Or if we go back to our lizard example, the observation was that lizards have bigger toes after hurricanes, and our question was, why is this the case? So in this case, the scientists thought that lizards with bigger toe pads are better able to grip onto branches and trees to survive, so that when the hurricanes blow through, basically all of the lizards with smaller toe pads are sort of blown away and they don't survive. So you're left with all of these bigger toe padded lizards after a hurricane. So from that, it's a little bit harder to test this particular hypothesis directly because it has to do with evolution, and we can't replicate hurricanes on these big islands. But in this case, the scientists did sort of figure out a way to test whether lizards with big toe pads are able to survive, are able to grab onto things better. And so what they did is they got these lizards and sort of let them crawl up onto poles and then use leaf blowers to just blow a bunch of strong winds at them. And then they timed how long does it take for the lizards to fall off, basically. And don't worry, they were falling into a cushion, so no lizards were harmed in this experiment. So the prediction was that lizards with big toe pads will better be able to hold on to a pole if there's wind being blown at them. And that is, in fact, what they saw. So the experiment in this case, what that lizards can hang on better if they have bigger toes, was supported by the data from the experiment. So when we're designing an experiment, we are going to be keeping in mind some different kinds of variables that will be involved. And I'm actually going to start in the middle right here with the independent variable. And this is going to be the variable that you're changing, the variable that you're adjusting, or you're manipulating in the experiment. And it's what's actually supposed to be causing the change that you're seeing in the experiment. So this could be lizard toe size in our lizard example. It could be maybe if I'm baking bread and I want to see if baking it at different temperatures affects how fluffy my bread gets, it could be the temperature of the oven. Those would be examples of independent variables. The dependent variable is the variable that should be changing due to the changing of the independent variable. So this is the response or the result or the thing that you're measuring, the results of your experiment, I guess is one way of putting it. So in this lizard example, it was how long the lizard could hold on to that pole. That was sort of the response that we were looking at. Um, in the bread example, it'd be like, how fluffy does my bread get as a result of changing the temperature? So dependent variable depends on the independent variable. You're changing the independent variable, and the dependent variable will show a shift in response. Everything else besides the independent variable, which we're manipulating, and the dependent variable, which is we're looking for a change, should be the same, should be kept as constant as possible. So everything else is what we're going to be calling a controlled variable. So these are variables that are held constant, and being careful about controlled variables allows you to be more confident that whatever you're seeing changing in the dependent variable is because of the change in the independent variable. So controlled variables just let us be certain that the only changes we're seeing are because the independent variable is being manipulated. So in our lizard example, we want to keep the poles the same. We want them to be the same height and the same width. We want the same wind tunnel situation, use the same leaf blowers. We want to treat the lizards the same before the experiment. In our phone example, we wouldn't want to be changing the charging cord and the outlet and clean out the charging port all at once before trying to test the phone, because then we wouldn't know which of those things actually allowed our phone to charge. So these are all the different kinds of variables for experimental design. And when we're plotting the results of our experiment, when we're showing what we got, a lot of times we'll be graphing, and we'll get more practice with this later in class, but generally you'll want to put your independent variable, the thing that you changed, down on the bottom on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, you'll plot the dependent variable. So that'll be what happened in the experiment. What results did you get? So independent variable on the x-axis, dependent variable on the y-axis. Okay, so just a couple final notes before we finish off this lecture. So we can get two big categories of data from an experiment, and both are equally valid in science. So I think a lot of people think of numbers as being a big kind of scientific outcome or the output of a scientific experiment. But experiments can also yield qualitative data, which is descriptive, as well as the quantitative or numerical data. So both kinds of data are good and useful. And yeah, qualitative like quality, so that's descriptive, and quantitative like quantity, so that's numerical. And then we also want to think about how many subjects do we need in order for our experiment to carry 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 water. So if we only used, one subject, then it's hard to know whether that was just an anomaly or whether it was a coincidence. So we want to make sure that we have a big enough sample size for our experiment to be credible. And then last slide, I promise. So we've been talking about hypothesis as the starting point for designing an experiment and making predictions. But in fact, not all research is hypothesis driven. Some people, especially in genetics, just sort of go in and sequence DNA and see what they find. So they're not looking for something before they start. They're just seeing what they find once they actually go in and get all of these DNA sequences back. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, but the steps of the scientific method aren't actually linear. A lot of times they're circular, and maybe you'll design an experiment, but then you go to actually do it and it doesn't work. So you have to go back and sort of refine that methodology. So we can think of the scientific method as being a lot more circular, actually, than linear. And then the final point is about the word theory. So we use theory in science in a very different way than how people use it in everyday usage. So a lot of times you'll hear people say like, "Oh, I have a theory about why this or that." And if you think about it, that's actually more like a hypothesis or maybe a prediction. They're using it as like a guess about why something is. But in science, a theory is very widely accepted, and it's got a ton of evidence behind it. It should also be able to generate new hypotheses, and it should be pretty broad. So we can think about the theory of evolution as being something that we have a ton of evidence behind it. We've got a lot of new branches of research sprouting off from it. Some other examples are the theory of gravity, the Big Bang theory, the theory of plate tectonics, so like how the Earth's plates move relative to one another. So yeah, just driving home the point that theory in science is different than how we use it in everyday life. Okay, so I think that's it for this video lecture, and I will see you all soon.